propaganda has proven to be most effective in situations where the control of information allows it to dominate a given information environment. Absent alternative sources of information, propaganda is then free to shape how a society collectively creates meaning and a shared reality. It is for this reason that controlling information is an essential component of propaganda. So join me now in the propaganda universe as we discuss the relationship between information control and propaganda. Inherent to propaganda is the necessity to suppress or neutralize opposing perspectives and contradictory information that undermines the goal of the propagandist. Propaganda concerns itself not only with producing and disseminating messages, but also minimizing information that is contrary to its purpose. To this effect, Leonard Doob wrote that a propagandist must not only act to influence people, but also to prevent them from being influenced by others. Regarding the interplay between disseminating propaganda and controlling information, Harold Lasswell states that the problem a propagandist must consider is thinking through how to intensify the attitudes favorable to his purpose, to reverse the attitudes hostile to it, and to attract the indifferent, or, at the worst, to prevent them from assuming a hostile bent. Taking a broader view, Jacques Ellul asserts that propaganda does not tolerate discussion and inherently excludes contradiction and discussion, with the end result being the nullification of the opposition. To this point, Jowett and O'Donnell argue that in situations where a dominant frame is created in the presence of persistent and unchallenged messaging, the messages have greater influence. In other words, the greater the suppression of opposing information, the more effective a message becomes. This is most apparent in totalitarian systems, where a combination of censorship, restricted access to external information, and control over the media is required to generate support for the regime and squash information that potentially undermines the political system. Contemporary authoritarian governments are aided in this respect by technology such as packet inspection systems at internet exchange points or internet service providers who filter out undesirable information, as is the case with the SORM system in Russia and the so-called Great Firewall of China. In democratic systems, the control of information takes different forms than in authoritarian systems. Because democratic systems generally feature freedom of speech guarantees, the techniques used to control information take a different form. One way democratic governments control information is by controlling media access. Journalists who are favorably inclined towards an administration's policies are given preferential access to senior government officials than those who are critical. Access to government-sourced information is vital for journalists who cover related issues, which can make or break their careers. There is also significant pressure on media companies to scoop their competition, which also requires access to government sources. In the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, for example, government political operatives selected Judith Miller of the New York Times to share misleading information on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program. Presumably, Miller was viewed as a credible source from a flagship media company who was supportive of the administration's claims. Her reporting drew a lot of attention, and because it was published in the New York Times, lent significant weight to the Bush administration's rationale for the invasion. Sometime after the invasion, however, her reporting was debunked and she was discredited as a journalist. In contrast, night writer journalists who were reporting in opposition to the administration's rationale for invading Iraq did not receive the same degree of access. In the end, this worked in their favor. Free from the constraint of having to adhere to the administration's policy in exchange for access, they were able to make independent judgments regarding the argument for going to war. They became known as the journalists who got Iraq right. Governments can also directly control information as they selectively decide which information to release or withhold, when to do it, and how to frame it. An example of this is when Attorney General Barr gave a press conference on the Mueller report findings prior to its release to the public and misrepresented its conclusions. His misleading statements were intended to positively frame the report prior to it being subjected to public scrutiny. Getting in front of an issue by framing it in a favorable way is an important technique in the public relations and political communication industry, as initial impressions are difficult to change. Attorney General Barr's actions were largely effective as they served to diffuse further public interest by essentially saying, "Nothing to see here." This despite the fact that the actual conclusions of the report were based on strong evidence that linked senior Trump campaign officials with known Russian military intelligence operatives. Another form of information control is exerted in a digital environment based on the social dynamics resident in technologically enabled social networks. The ability for users to self-select content consistent with their worldview creates echo chambers that reinforce ideological homophily. Homophily is the tendency for people to seek out or be attracted to those who are similar to themselves. Belonging to a network defined by its ideological homophily produces social influence dynamics, as membership requires adherence to the program code that determines the network's rules and goals. Social influence in the network rewards behaviors that are seen to add value consistent with the code and punishes those deemed to be divergent. This effectively creates a self-policing system of information control within a social network. Social media architecture also acts to narrow exposure to alternative information and perspectives. Because advertising is the primary source of revenue for social media companies, the sites themselves are designed to maximize user engagement, which is the basis for monetizing social connections. Designed according to profit incentives, social media site algorithms feed content to keep users engaged while at the same time screening out information that might cause a user to disengage. In effect, social media architecture controls information by creating a technological filter bubble. Undermining the credibility of opposing sources of information is a long-standing technique for exerting information control. Source credibility has long been known to be an important component of persuasion. In an important study of source credibility, Hovland and Weiss found that when a source was determined to be untrustworthy, there was an increase in resistance towards the acceptance of a message from that source. Therefore, when the credibility of a source is deliberately put into question, the intent is to increase resistance to any message that may originate from that source. This achieves a propagandist's goal of neutralizing opposing communication. There are various ways to neutralize opposing communication. One tactic commonly used is in the form of a personal attack, character assassination, or smear campaign. This is done by affixing what is perceived to be a negative label on a person, such as fascist, socialist, or communist. Another technique is the manipulation of the meaning of words to fit a political agenda, similar to Newspeak from George Orwell's 1984. An example of this is negatively transforming the meaning of the term mainstream media. By itself, the term mainstream media simply means the established mass media which functions in a more or less traditional manner. That is, with content produced by professional journalists who adhere to certain standards and where editorial scrutiny is applied. In some political communication, the meaning that is assigned to the term is meant to be derogatory. Specifically, that it can't be trusted, is elitist, left-wing, and is fake news. In doing so, a propaganda actor intends to discredit an oppositional source of information and influence people to disregard it. When discrediting these sources, it is common practice for the propaganda actor to repetitiously promote itself as being the only one who provides the real truth. We find examples in slogans such as telling the untold, real news, real honest opinion, and most watched, most trusted. Finally, we should always keep in mind that where there are instances of information control such as these, there also exists propaganda. Conversely, where we find propaganda, there will also be a corresponding effort to impose some type of information control. If we want to avoid manipulation, we need to be on alert that if we detect either an attempt at information control or propaganda, we need to expect being subjected to the other. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode and that you'll join me in the next. If you'd like to download and listen to a podcast version of this channel's videos, they are available through most of the podcast directories such as on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Podchaser, and Podcast Index. Or you can visit either the Propaganda Universe's Buzzsprout page or main website through the links located in the video description. And as always, please remember to like, subscribe, and share this video. By sharing the videos from this channel, you are making a valuable contribution towards helping fellow citizens avoid the negative effects of manipulative communication and propaganda. Another way to contribute is to join Propaganda Universe's Patreon community of supporters or by making a contribution through PayPal and the links also found in the description. I hope to see you again for the next episode, and thank you so much for joining me in the Propaganda Universe.